Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the AMATIC webinar series, Faculty Development and Equity in an Era of Mathematics Reform, with our presiders, Dr. Alycia Marshall and Dr. Lucy Michal. The views expressed by the presenters are not necessarily the views of AMATIC. Commercial products mentioned by the presenters are not endorsed by AMATIC. This is sponsored by McGraw-Hill, who has sponsored the 2019 webinar series. And now, Dr. Michal, I will let you switch over to your slides and we will begin the webinar.
All right, good morning, everyone. I just want to say a little bit about myself. I taught mathematics at El Paso Community College for many, many years, and I am retired now, but I did a lot of work with both developmental and courses and also college level courses. I'm currently a leadership fellow for the Dana Center Mathematics Pathways. Alycia, do you want to introduce yourself now or right before your slides?
Sure. I am right now an Associate Vice President for Learning and Academic Affairs at Anne Arundel Community College in Maryland. But prior to that, I was the Department Chair of Mathematics for about 5 years here at the college, and also a math faculty member for about 20 years. So I come with some experience in teaching, like Lucy, both developmental and credit level mathematics, and working with faculty in many areas of mathematics reform.
Okay, so I don't have control.
Oh.
Okay, here you go. All right, so these 3 chapters that we're gonna talk about today are from the Emerging Issues in Mathematics Pathways monograph. There's a link to that on there. And then also a link to some of the resources on equity that Alycia has for you today. My chapter is on faculty engagement for creating and sustaining mathematics pathways. So the Emerging Issues monograph can be downloaded for free. It has case studies and scans of the field and recommendations from around 24 authors nationwide. And if you will see, this is a nice little picture that they took when we had a writer's workshop, a whole week of writing with our editors where we finalized many of the chapters. So the monograph has 15 chapters that are organized and aligned around the Dana Center Math Pathways theory of change that believes that the change will be systemic and sustainable when it is faculty-driven, administrator-supported, policy-enabled, and culturally enforced. You will have copies of the PowerPoint, and everywhere we have the links to these things in a variety of slides. So before we start, I wanted you to use your chat and talk about faculty development. And so what is the main purpose for faculty development at your campus? Share this on the webinar chat, and remember to click the option to share with all the participants and panelists. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that, and then I'll start. So the chapter on faculty engagement was co-authored by Michael Ortman of Oklahoma State University. That's a 4-year school, and so we had the experiences of mathematics pathways implementation from there. And I'm from El Paso Community College, and so I have the experiences of a 2-year school implementing mathematics pathways. It has really processes that sustain faculty engagement. We found that analysis of data to identify problems and solutions, and then designing and implementing solutions, evaluation of the process, and understanding the changes that come with any kind of implementation, especially the mathematics pathways. And so we will talk very briefly. The chapter has a lot more than what I'll present to you today. So when we take a look at faculty development and engagement, we know that for anything that involves curricular transformation, it's key to have an overwhelming involvement of faculty. And so we're treating the idea that if you're engaging faculty all semester long or all year long, that the development comes along with that engagement. And so it's really not about attempts to change people, but rather engaging the faculty so that they have early on and very focused conversations that are ongoing all semester, between semesters, on to the next semester, and all of those conversations starting with data. So like I was, many faculty can be very skeptical of any new approaches, but when you look at large-scale data, the data is going to show student success measures that need attention, and also areas that can be where students might be better served, and it will give faculty the urgency to scale once they see the data. So it also shows faculty the number of students that never even get to the courses that they teach because of a variety of reasons, or the ones that do get to your course may not continue to the next course. The data will show a lot of this. And then if you use any kind of data from places where mathematics pathways have been implemented, and you can see the increased measures of student success, that's going to help facilitate implementation, scaling, and sustaining the math implementation, the implementation of math pathways at your campus. Just a note of caution, not all data needs to be explored at once. You can get inundated with so much data that there's no time for much more work. So it is important that all faculty are involved at the very beginning, but a key team of faculty leaders is important so that you have invited all mathematics faculty, but there's a team that is actually doing a lot of the major work. Involving faculty in partner disciplines and advisors and administrators is very key right at the beginning. It is important that everyone is doing this, and include faculty and advisors, if possible, from neighboring 2-year and 4-year partners. The time that you do this can be used to foster broad faculty engagement and ownership, not necessarily buying into what you're doing, but ownership if they're involved with data analysis at the beginning, design, and an implementation. One of the things that Texas and Oklahoma did is we took an inventory of all the specific mathematical competencies that were required for programs of study. So for example, in Texas, we have a survey of all of the Texas 4-year schools and their programs and what mathematics courses are required for those programs. It's very useful when you try to take a look at conversations around mathematics prerequisites, placement, and competencies. So engaging your faculty will give them time to talk and have really rich discussions centered around the prerequisites for each of the, where students are going, their programs of study, and their broader pursuits. And collaborating with the partner institutions in the conversations and sharing their practices and will facilitate transfer, prerequisite, and placement policies. This proves to be very, very beneficial. So once you get them in meetings, it's a good strategy is to share lessons of the mathematics pathways. The lessons will showcase a lot of the competencies that are in those lessons that are required for where students are going to go in their programs of study. The professional development should also focus, whenever possible, on all the advances that we know about how students learn mathematics in the classroom. And because faculty can be overwhelmed just with change, the new curricula that you are choosing to use or will be developing will have pedagogy and assessments and transformed classroom structure. So it's very critical to help faculty adjust to the change. And so faculty development that focuses on all of the advances that we know about the learning sciences will enrich the conversations, and faculty will start to share many things that they're doing. So professional development that is focused on the advances of learning sciences will engage faculty in conversations about how students learn. It gives time for faculty to incorporate and adapt learning processes in their courses, and not all can be done immediately. And so it's good to have the conversations with others to see what people are looking and using and struggling with and finding solutions for. So if you include ways for faculty to develop, activate, and look at students' development of growth mindsets, then it is a large part of the active learning that is being used in the mathematics pathways curricula. So giving attention to all of these is really part of the agenda for equity, in that there's a lot of attention in the curriculum that is given to interplay between the tasks and all the intellectual pursuits and goals that students bring, but more importantly, the resources that students bring to their own learning as well. So a key recommendation from the chapter is to provide a continuous cycle to engage faculty in program redesign and implementation. So again, the early engagement of faculty to collect and review data, to look at courses and programs of study, ongoing conversations with comprehensive groups of faculty from not only their discipline, but other STEM fields, and as well as non-STEM fields, and faculty from partner institutions, is going to help really take a look at giving you a good design and a good implementation experience. So the professional development that you have is really when you discuss data and identify math courses and clarify prerequisites, placement, and practices, all of this incorporated with learning sciences is really a large kind of broad agenda to engage faculty, not in a professional development, just one time at the beginning of semester event, but as an engagement throughout the semester. And then at the end, a review of the impact that that change has on whatever you have implemented, how that has changed student achievement will allow you to go back and change things to your implementation. But more importantly, it will identify some faculty leaders that will continue the next cycle of engaging faculty and your program redesign and implementation. And I end with a quote from Kagan and Leahy that really the faculty development that we're talking about is really engagement, broad engagement of faculty, because we're really not talking about changing hearts and minds, but rather the engagement and the conversations will help clarify and emphasize really how to promote the individual's pre-existing values. All of those things are inside faculty. You just need to have conversations that will bring them out. Alycia?
Yes, hi, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. I am going to talk about two chapters that I co-wrote, and this was also in the same monograph as what Lucy has discussed. But the first chapter I'm going to talk about, let me make sure I have control over here. I think I went a little bit ahead of myself. Okay, so the first chapter I'm going to talk about was Mathematics Pathways and Equity, Considering Progress from Multiple Perspectives. So the purpose of this chapter was really to look at and define 4 different perspectives of equity and student success from various communities within the field, and how to provide recommendations to enact change, particularly with a focus on identifying and addressing issues of equity within the mathematics pathways implementation approach. And the process by which we did this was my co-author, Francesca Leahy, and I actually reviewed artifacts. And specifically, we reviewed consensus-derived artifacts about equity, diversity, and student success, such as position statements, mission and vision statements, strategic plans, and priority initiatives from communities of mathematics educators, professionals, administrators, and policy actors, communities whose perspectives are especially relevant in the analysis of equity, student success, and mathematics education. As a result of that review, we came up with 4 perspectives on equity and student success. And as I go through these, what you'll probably realize is that there's some overlap, and that if you think about where you're approaching or looking at mathematics pathways and implementation and how it may be impacting equity, you may see some crossover between and among these perspectives. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about each perspective. So the first one we'll talk about is access. So from the access perspective, when we looked at these artifacts, we really discovered that access and access viewpoint, or an access perspective to looking at equity in terms of mathematics pathways, really involved allowing access to mathematics and, for example, subsequent careers that result from mathematics knowledge, such as STEM careers. For example, making sure that there's access to all populations with a particular focus on students of color, low-income students, English learners, and students with disabilities. So in the lens of mathematics pathways, one of the ways you can argue that there's an access perspective that accompanies the implementation of mathematics pathways is that allowing students access to credentials, degrees by aligning mathematics with programs of study is particularly making a credential more accessible to students who primarily in the past may not have had access. So that's one way to look at the access lens. And as a result of the review of the access lens through looking at the artifacts, we came up with an access narrative. And this is what it would sound like. All students, especially underserved student groups or those in under-resourced learning environments, deserve access to high-quality inputs and learning opportunities. However, disparities in access and opportunity continue to persist, preventing student success. Prominent solutions include providing equal or differentiated funding and supports that include effective instruction and leadership, challenging content, and differentiated or unique supports necessary to succeed. And one of the themes that you're going to see as we talk about these different perspectives is that the mathematics pathways implementation has really made a lot of progress in terms of, in my opinion, in terms of addressing issues of equity. And I get into more of that in the second chapter when we look at the outcomes. But one of the things that we notice also is that there are still persistent, or I would say opportunity gaps among various groups, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So the second perspective is outcomes. An outcomes perspective is the viewpoint that all students should achieve equitable outcomes, or students should perform at about the same level of achievement regardless of demographics, example, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status, with a particular focus on looking at outcomes of underserved populations, low-income students, and students of color. You could argue that the math pathways have allowed increased outcomes for all students, and that students have improved in their outcomes and their credit level courses as a result of the pathways, and I'll get into more details of that in a minute. This has also impacted in many of the different implementations opportunities for students of color and low-income students who are doing very well through many of the pathways approaches. The outcomes narrative that we could propose would sound something like this. All students, especially underprepared and historically underrepresented and underserved student groups, should be supported to meet or surpass academic achievement and attainment objectives, including college readiness and completion. However, achievement and attainment gaps persist and prevent the field from realizing success for all students. Prominent solutions include targeted, evidence-based programs and interventions. The next perspective is diversity inclusion. And this perspective focuses on historically underrepresented students, especially in higher education and STEM or mathematics. Benefits for all students focus on inclusion, particularly of marginalized groups, for example, students of color, women, students in poverty, students with disabilities, or students identifying as LGBTQ, or those of religious minority, or considered in the religious minority. The goals to address this issue of equity through a diversity and inclusion lens would be to enhance the diversity of faculty, staff, and students, to focus on retention, recruitment, and matriculation and completion, and attend to both demographic diversity and foster climates and cultures that support diversity. There are several barriers to this, and that is the current existing lack of diversity of faculty and staff, particularly in departments of mathematics, perhaps an unwelcome atmosphere in post-secondary STEM classes for certain groups, low expectations of students, and exclusive, quote-unquote, exclusive education for STEM, lack of awareness, and these types of things can be helped through mentoring, awareness building, fostering environments that embrace diversity and inclusion, and a repeated cycle of that addresses a repeated cycle of lack of diversity in the pipeline, especially in areas of STEM. One of the other proposed solutions to this could also be considering inclusive pedagogy and alternative representations and diverse representations of students within the mathematics curriculum or text. A diversity and inclusion narrative that we mentioned in the paper is all students, especially low performing and historically underrepresented and marginalized student groups, should be proportionally represented and authentically engaged in academic and professional roles and environments, such that students advance in academic and professional pipelines, especially those of high value. However, disparities in representation and inclusion persist, and prominent solutions include the development of mentoring programs and fostering of welcoming environments for academic and professional cultures. The last perspective, which I'll introduce here, is social justice. This is a focus on all people with emphasis on groups who have been historically marginalized and underserved in math education and society. This lens looks at implementation of mathematics pathways as equitable mathematics education for all students. A remedy to this through a social justice perspective could be allowing students to see themselves in a curriculum similar to the diversity and inclusion lens, but using mathematics as an analytical tool to critique society. There's structures that allow for learning to be equitable and opportunity and outcomes for all students, regardless of where they come from and their demographics. There are several barriers to this approach. Deficit views of mathematics ability, disparities in learning opportunities and outcomes in mathematics education based on race, class, culture, language, gender, etc., and mathematics being looked at as a gatekeeper. In addition, this perspective talks about the current mathematics education environment as being unjust and grounded in a legacy of institutional discrimination based on race, ethnicity, class, and gender. So the pathways implementation have really, in my opinion, allowed opportunities for students to use math as an analytical tool as we work to align mathematics with program of study. Depending on the type of implementation, there's improved outcomes across race, class, culture, and I'll get into that in the second chapter. So the last narrative I want to read to you is the social justice narrative, which says, from this perspective, all students, especially student groups that have been historically marginalized and underserved in mathematics education and society, deserve to learn in a just, equitable, and sustainable system of mathematics education in which students succeed and critically apply knowledge and skills to learning about and addressing social issues. However, deficit views, disparities in mathematics learning opportunities and outcomes, and the use of mathematics as a gatekeeping tool persist and prevent the achievement of this goal. To overcome these barriers, advocates recommend acknowledging the injustices of the current system and taking action at multiple levels of the system to create and sustain institutional structures, policies, and practices that lead to just and equitable learning opportunities, experiences, and outcomes for all students. So we have several recommendations from this chapter. One is that I have people in the field identify metrics associated with the different dimensions of equity. As I introduced this, I talked about how one may see how these perspectives actually overlap with one another. And if you're looking at trying to improve outcomes for students, particularly students of color, low income, it's important that as we look at the mathematics pathways and whether or not they're being successful or not, that we're using the right metrics that are associated with the dimensions that we're thinking about. Considering equity implications for research and action from multiple perspectives. This also speaks to what I was talking about before. For example, if you're coming from a diversity and inclusion lens, you may look at the representations of various student groups within the curriculum, within the text. If you're looking at an access lens, you may look for how are the pathways allowing increased access for certain student groups or demographics. And the last recommendation from this chapter was to support stakeholders in considering multiple perspectives, to look at equity from various lenses, the 4 that we recommended, but also to make sure that as a stakeholder, as someone that's interested in improving outcomes for students, that you're considering not just one particular perspective. Now I'm going to go into the Gateway Course Outcome chapter. So these 2 chapters were pretty much related. One, as I mentioned before, the first one talked about the multiple perspectives that pathways can be viewed in terms of equity. This chapter really focuses more on the Gateway Course Outcomes and how are the pathways doing. We looked at various different types of pathways implementation across the country, and we wanted to consider how are they moving towards equity. So the next slide shows you the 4 different groups of pathways that we looked at, and you probably are familiar with many of these. We looked at the Carnegie Quantway Statway, we looked at the California Acceleration Project, the Dana Center Math Pathways, as well as the co-requisite models. So I'll just summarize a little bit about what happened in each of these types of implementations of pathways. In the Carnegie Quantway and Statway, the curriculum for the Carnegie Pathways was implemented in 56 institutions in 14 states across the country. And the evidence suggests that the pathways achieve measurable success for all students, including students of color and students in poverty, in half the time relative to traditional developmental education. So if you look at comparison of Statway students to students in traditional developmental mathematics sequences at community colleges in 4-year across 10 states, 58% of the Statway students earned a grade of C or above in a college-level math course, while only 22% in a comparison group. Students of color, which is what we were interested in looking at in terms of the equity lens, they actually tended to outperform their counterparts in both Statway and Quantway. When you looked at students that were in the Quantway or Statway model versus a traditional, so we have some statistics in here in our chapter that speak to the improved success rates for those students. The other thing I want to focus on with the Quantway and Statway is that, for example, positive effects were found in Quantway 1 across all gender and racial ethnic subgroups, with Black male students and Latino students demonstrating the largest increase in completion rates. For Latinos, success rates in Quantway were 66 and 69 compared to 35 for traditional enrolled Hispanic students, according to Klippel. So we saw a lot of improvement, not only for all students in the Quantway and Statway approach, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with a lot of the data, so I won't go into that too much, but we also saw improvement for the students of color, particularly African Americans and Hispanic students. The next group of implementation pathways we looked at was the California Acceleration Project. And it was founded in 2010. It's a mathematics pathway approach implemented at 84 community colleges in California, with multiple studies showing increased student success in less time, I think that's the theme, less time than traditional developmental education, according to California Acceleration Project. And some of the stats from that is that implementing the redesigned pathways with the just-in-time remediation aligned with the different placement approaches improved success rates for students, particularly in California. You think about the population of students there in certain areas and certain colleges, very heavy Hispanic populations and students of color. So these results were quite promising in terms of looking at things from an equity standpoint. Evidence indicates that the California Acceleration Project had a positive effect on success and completion among students of color. We spoke about that. CAP students that were Black had the same odds of completing their mathematics pathways as their white counterparts, minimizing or successfully eliminating the achievement gap, according to Hayward and Willett. So persistence gaps we found when we looked at this also remain. In addition to having the success rates, we also noticed that when you look at the higher success rates for students of color in CAP, completing the transfer level course than traditionally enrolled counterparts, persistent gaps were remaining between white and Hispanic and Black students. And this was shown by Hayward and Willett. So one of the things that we started to think about in terms of the implementation of the pathways was, are students improving, which that seemed to be the case, are there persistent gaps? So the Dana Center pathway was the third model, and the students in the Dana Center pathway, which is actually different implementation methods depending on where you are, but it was implemented in over 16 states across the country, and it makes the case that many students will successfully learn mathematics in a rigorous and relevant courses that are part of a well-designed mathematics pathway, aligning programs, mathematics to programs of study, and allowing them to enter college-level courses. I think I saw one question was about the metrics, and for most of these pathway implementation models that we used, we looked at success in the college-level course after completion of the developmental course or the developmental pathway. So depending on what type of model it was, we were looking at and comparing the success of the student in the credit level or college level math course versus a student in a traditional math course, developmental math course sequence. So the Dana Center curriculum has measurably increased student success in Texas. Institutions, including students of color and low-income students, have less time than traditional developmental ed, and they're actually completing at higher rates. They completed their credit-bearing math classes with 1 year, whereas comparison traditional students can take as long as 3 years. They also found that the DCMP students were more likely to complete their developmental math requirements and enroll in past credit level math courses than students enrolled in traditional sequence. So positively impact students, Dana Center pathways, also positive impact for students of color and low-income students, which were part of the population. The last model is co-requisite, and I'm going to go to some other slides with that before I get into that too much, but the co-requisite model, as many of you know about already, is when you pair a course, a credit level course, with either a helper course, some people call it, or a just-in-time remedial course, and the students actually complete both courses, and in some cases, in most cases, in the results of the data shows that they actually succeed at a higher rate, and it's less time because they didn't have to take a single semester to take and complete a developmental course. I want to look at this last slide. I think I'm going backward. Oh, I think I messed up. I'm trying to go backwards. It's not allowing me to do that. Okay. I'm having a little technical difficulty because I can't see the way to go back, and I've gone completely through.
See if we can help you here.
I'm doing previous, but I think that's taking.
Okay, Alycia, give me just a second. Let me see if I'm going to request control. Okay. Here it goes.
Okay, I want to get to that. All right, and then I think. Do I have control back now?
Which slide are you looking for?
I'm looking for the one after this one. I mean, yes.
That one?
Keep going. That's
no, that's fine.
I think
okay, you should be able to go forward from here. Maybe you can find it.
Okay. I think I have to request control again. Hold on. Sorry about this, guys. Okay. says I'm controlling now, so I should be, here we go. All right, thank you. So, apologize for that. So let me just get to this slide. So this was a good slide that basically collected all of the evidence of math pathways across multiple math pathways implementations. As you can see, the CAP project is on here, Dana Center Math Pathways is on here. And there's also the Statway as well as co-requisite initiatives, which I described a little bit a few minutes ago, that have been implemented in states, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Indiana. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about the Tennessee implementation as well. That's seen really good progress. But you can see from this slide, this is a really good visual to show how the success rates have increased in the pathway implementation if you compare to a traditional 20% college level, developmental to college level traditional course sequence, and then the time frame as well. You're looking at 3 years versus 1 year or 1 semester with co-recs. And so this is very promising overall, looking at all of the pathway outcomes. So we want to get into like details a little bit about not only just the pathway success, but also in terms of the equity piece. So Tennessee had a very successful implementation of a co-requisite model for math success. And this is a very good representation of the success. If you look at the co-requisite implementation, full implementation, and the green bar shows you how much better that the students did overall, regardless of ACT math score, versus how they would do in a traditional prerequisite model. And this is with the co-requisite remediation at full scale across the Tennessee community colleges. So overall, it looks like something in terms of a pathway, particularly in this case, a co-requisite model, is really successful for all students, which is great. This next slide focuses more in on the minority students, and this is also showing improvement for minority students as well. Significant gains were shown across all ACT score levels. And the achievement gap was essentially eliminated for Tennessee with successful college level course completion for 73% of minority students compared to 75% for all students, with 72% of low-income students passing in the credit course. So the success rate of minority students also increased. This slide is really just focusing on the minority students and how the minority students did much better in the co-requisite model. But if all of the data revealed from Tennessee shows that the minority students were really performing at almost the same rate in this co-req model as white students. So that was extremely promising. And we were excited to see that this co-requisite model, particularly in Tennessee, might actually be eliminating achievement gaps in terms of an equity lens. So the chapter goes into a little bit more detail. Here's a summary of what we saw with the California Acceleration Project data, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, so I'll go through that. And then we had some recommendations for the field. One of the things is we definitely think that there's opportunity and a need for additional research, because although across the board there seems to be an increase in access to certain levels of mathematics through the pathways, which is good, there's additional research that we feel is necessary to, number one, through an access lens, determine whether or not math pathways implementation is in some ways tracking students, and are students allowed access to mathematics and STEM careers as they should be. And that's one piece. And the other piece is looking at the outcome success rates for the math pathways. Are the gaps still persisting? Because even though overall everybody is doing much better, in some cases when we looked at the data and the results, we saw that there was still a gap. It's just that the gap moved up. So one of the things that you think about in terms of looking at math pathways through an equity lens is, are students succeeding across the board, and are there still opportunity gaps in the case of the pathways? So there's other recommendations here. Analyze unintended consequences of attending to particular dimensions of equity, and identifying and addressing questions about equity and math pathways that reflect the various perspectives mentioned in the previous chapter on equity and the purpose of mathematics education. So let me go to the next slide. So this is overall, and I kind of mentioned this already, that the pathways seem to be doing great. More research is needed. However, in some cases, there are still some achievement gaps. So I have an equity for the chat, and then an equity activity for the chat, and then I think we'll have some time for questions and answers. This is a question that perhaps you can think about in terms of your own campus and your own institution. What do you think are 3 obstacles to eliminating or minimizing achievement gaps in mathematics on your campuses? And if you could just reply there, and we'll talk about that briefly and then hopefully have a few minutes for questions. Be sure to select all panelists and attendees so that we can see. Okay, I'm seeing reliable access to technology. Yes, that could be a problem. Unwillingness to imagine new ways of teaching. So I'm just going to address that question. I'm seeing several different really good questions are popping up. One of the things that I did in my department when I was department chair was actually, and Lucy talked about this in terms of faculty development and how it should be faculty-led. One of the things that we did was actually look at our data for our own institution, which, as you can imagine, mirrors data across the country in terms of the low success rates of developmental students. But we actually disaggregated the data, and faculty were surprised at what we saw. And the faculty in the department actually were the ones that said, this is not right and we need to do something about it. Our African-American male students were performing at dismal rates in our developmental course sequence. And so they actually were the ones to initiate and respond to it. So one of the ways that you can maybe get people to think about change is to take some time and looking at your own success rates, because a lot of times when you look at what's happening in California and Texas and different places, some people don't resonate with that. They need to see what's happening with their own students, and then they may be motivated to change. That's one suggestion. Understanding you guys are firing these in so quickly. I'm trying to read. Outdated materials can prevent full implementation of updated curriculum and diminish rigor. That is a definite concern. I think I saw somebody's question earlier in response to Lucy's presentation about OERs and the opportunities possibly to maybe update curriculum and materials without high costs. I'm gonna turn my camera back on because I'm realizing I'm not on camera. So I think we can continue to talk about these concerns. Everybody has different concerns, but I want to make sure also that there's time for questions, since there were some questions earlier for Lucy as well. So I don't know how do we, okay, so one of the questions I'm seeing there, unfortunately, in my view, I can only see a question for a second and then it goes away.
Alycia, if you kind of click around the edges, you can expand the chat window. When I go to the top, you should be able to.
Okay, you guys have.
You can see more.
I think I can see them now. You guys have some really great questions, and I feel bad because I feel like we should have more time. One of the things, the last question I'll pick up on, our biggest obstacle is our labor model. Because all our lower level math courses are taught by adjuncts, students are less able to visit instructors in office hours. Instructors are less aware of what's happening on campus. So that is a problem, and I think if I had a solution for that, it would be above my pay grade. But I know we all have to deal with the increasing numbers of adjuncts, and there's opportunities for professional development with adjuncts that can be online, can engage them without having to come to campus. I know that's also a struggle, and also can help them stay connected, an online community of learners, providing opportunities for professional development online. And that kind of speaks a little bit to, I think, what Lucy was talking about earlier as a way to address that. I'm going to, my chat window has disappeared, so I'm not sure. I'm seeing everybody's video. I'm not seeing the chat. Lucy, can you see the chat? Maybe you can.
I'm just now getting to the chat, and I do have a question here about how do we engage colleagues who dismiss data, for example, by focusing or fixing the student rather than looking at our work. What Alycia did say that, and that is that we did disaggregate most of our data. I mean, all of it. We are 85% Hispanic, but within, we always kept the question in mind that within the 85% Hispanic, there are different levels of, or different subgroups of students. And so, for example, males of color or the military students. And so we when you disaggregate data in other ways, not just by gender, ethnicity, and age, for example, if you can look at your own campus and figure out what other subgroups there are, like for us, we had military families, that might show people a little bit more, a deeper dive into the data. And if they're dismissing it, then I think, ask them, what other data would you like to take a look at? Or what, there's just a large part of just looking at data is having time to look at it, process it, ask hard questions. What does it say? How do we fix this group here? Or why do you think this is happening? It's a hard thing to do, but it's needed. And I think that eventually people will start looking at data if you start looking at some different subgroups.
I'm going to pick up on one of the questions I saw. I believe it's from Anne, about how do we focus on closing achievement gaps, particularly in the STEM pathways. And I feel like we're sort of in a loop with that. It's very difficult because of the underrepresentation of certain groups in STEM. And with the underrepresentation of certain groups in STEM pathways, there's going to be underrepresentation of people in the field in terms of faculty and staff and all of that. So it's almost a very difficult loop, because one of the things I think students benefit from is seeing themselves and feeling that they're included in the classroom. When they walk into a classroom and they're the only student of color, or they're the only female, it causes a whole nother level of challenges. And so I feel like it's very difficult. I feel like the first thing that we probably need to consider, or one of the things that we need to consider, and I mentioned this with the diversity and inclusion lens, is really, really being intentional about increasing recruitment and retention of underrepresented groups in the faculty and the staff side, so that students at least see themselves there. I mean, that's one thing that we can look towards. And I think when a student walks into a class, no one's there that looks like them, there's no faculty in the department that look like them, it is really, it's kind of a, you're not going to make it in this type of environment message that is sent without meaning to be sent. So that's one of the things. There's a lot of other things, but in the interest of time, I think recruitment and retention of underrepresented groups in the STEM faculty in higher ed and staff would be helpful as a start.
So I did pick up on some other questions here. One is, I'm not understanding the strategic lessons. What we did is we had a strategic lesson. It, for example, would be a lesson where that is in your math implementation in one of the courses. Either you've redesigned it or it's a lesson that is already there in one of your courses. If you take a lesson that really is looking at mathematics that the criminal justice person or major is going to look at, or a strategic lesson that would show how students can use mathematics to critique society, those lessons, we have a lot of those lessons in the Mathematics Pathways course curriculum that we're using from the Dana Center. So if you take one of those lessons and go through the lesson with whomever is meeting with you, faculty, advisors, other faculty from other disciplines, those are really, they're eye-openers for faculty. So that's the strategic lesson I'm talking about. And also, there's a question that says, what data are we talking about? So we looked at data, for example, we looked at data, of course, but we also looked at when did students register? Did they register right before the class started? Because we have students can register up until even 2 days after school starts. And so we looked at when did the student register and how that group did when they succeeded. So it told us a lot about getting more students to register early on before the semester starts. Another type of lesson or data is like when were students finishing their math course? If they came into in fall of 2016, but they took their first math course not until maybe 3 semesters after, and then how long it took them to do that, as opposed to the student that immediately starts the math course and finishes it early. So we looked at that data. We also looked at data that showed us what programs students were enrolled in and how long it took those students to finish their math course. So there's just, when you get faculty together, you just need to kind of have conversations that will give you these other types of data. We're used to looking at data, when we start, and then achievement data at the end. But there's lots of other measures in between that you could be looking at. And then there's another question about, let me see, how can I get a copy of the chapter? The chapter, the whole monograph is on a link that is on those first 2 or 3 slides that I believe the AMATIC is going to post, right? Are you posting?
Right, the slides will be posted.
Yeah, so those 2 links will take you directly to a free download of the entire monograph. And I don't know if I am missing other questions, but
I saw one question about what are the, what are these programs doing that are making them successful? So I'm going to just briefly mention a few themes across the board for some of the pathway implementations. One of the things is that, particularly in the co-requisite model, what faculty who created the curriculums there did was they looked at what they thought the students actually needed. So in order to be successful in a course, and really kind of pared things down to provide a kind of just-in-time remediation opportunity for students. So it minimized the time they had to be in class, and they did get rid of some things that they thought were not essential to the student being successful in the credit course, and they eliminated that from the remedial part or the developmental part of the course. So that was one of the things that they did. If you think about shortening the time, you're automatically, in some ways, increasing the opportunity for success, because as we know, the longer it takes somebody to do something, the more opportunities there is for something to intervene and prevent them from persisting. So there's that piece as well, shortening the time. Also, the pathway overall model is about aligning mathematics with programs of study. So what they looked at in terms of developing curriculum for the pathways implementation across the board was, what type of mathematics does the student need for this program? And let's focus on that as opposed to having every student being prepared for calculus, taking college algebra. And so you're then allowing maybe a course that a student could take to receive a credential that may not be as rigorous as a calculus course or a college algebra pathway. However, they're still gaining access to the credential. So those are a couple of, kind of high-level things that pathway models did, and that may have contributed to them being successful models for implementation.
We got about 2 more minutes left. Lucy or Alycia, would you be willing to stay after if people still had questions, or do you want to respond to those by email?
I can stay for a few more minutes, but I can also respond by email if we don't get to something, if somebody sends me. I do want to say that one of the things that helped El Paso is that we were working with guided pathways with AACC. And so what we did is we got all the faculty that represented the different programs, and we had a math table. And so the faculty were able to take a look at and go to the math people and say, what course would be best for my program? And so that was very helpful, because everyone has college algebra or some form of algebra as a course for their program, not realizing that statistics, for example, would be a much better course. And so we did do that. It was called a speed dating, where you went to lots of different places, a lot of science tables, math tables, and every program had a person that could go and ask those kinds of questions as we were doing our meta majors for guided pathways.
Okay, as you can see, their emails just went off. Okay, but I have a few things to wrap up the webinar, and then I will stop the recording. Much like at a conference, you can always come up to the presenters afterwards if you still have questions. So let me officially end this, and then if anyone wants to continue to chat, if your question was missed, we can stay a few minutes after. Let me get my slides back up here. And oh, John, I think I just did what you told me not to do. Okay, so thank you for participating in today's webinar. If you're not a member of AMATIC, we have a link below. These slides will be available if you miss some of these links. We are on Facebook, so if you're not already a member, if you could join AMATIC through Facebook. The recording will be uploaded, probably take a week or two, at the following link there, or you can go to the AMATIC website to the webinar section to get the video recording. And if you would, we have 2 ways to evaluate this. We have a link, a bit.ly link to the SurveyMonkey, or for those of you that have the QR app, you can go directly to it from the icon there. And I'll leave those up on the screen. I'd like to thank Dr. Michal and Dr. Marshall for being here and answering questions. And it looks like we still have several people here. I will stop the recording, and we'll use the chat room if there are more questions to be answered. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.